Welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight we'll be delving back into a little bit of history and to see how that history affects us today. Our guest is Louise Knight, visiting scholar at Northwestern University, expert on, among other things, Jane Addams. Louise, thank you so much for being our guest tonight.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Well, Jane Addams is an interesting figure and one whom I'm betting most of our viewers don't know much about. They may know something about Hull House, one of her creations, but they may not even know that she did that or what the connection is or why she's even famous or who she was. So let's start with the basics. Who was Jane Addams?
Okay, and I have to say, since we're broadcasting in northern Illinois here, that there is the Jane Addams Toll Road. So happily, more and more people are wondering who is Jane Addams.
Who was this person, right?
Right. And Illinois now has an honorary day named after her, the Jane Addams Day, December 10th. So things are beginning to build curiosity about her. Jane Addams' most famous accomplishment is that she was the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Chicagoans do know her as the founder of Hull House, which is one of the nation's first settlement houses, founded in Chicago in 1889.
And we have to explain that. But a settlement house, that could be anything from a financial clearinghouse settling transactions to some place where settlers from the Old West came and bunkered down for the night. So what exactly was a settlement house?
Well, yeah, a settlement house was actually neither of those things. And it was an idea conceived in England and brought to this country by a number of people, including Addams. The idea is that in the 1880s, a lot like today, there were people getting increasingly very rich, and there were a lot of people who had very little money at all and were struggling in poverty. And a group of college-educated people said, this is not right. We live in the United States, they said, we live in a democracy. The two classes should not be so apart socially, so that they don't know each other as human beings, to just talk and be friends. And so the settlement house was an idea where people from a college background would move to an industrial neighborhood, in this case on the near west side, on Halsted Street in Polk, and they would take up residence there. They would, quote, settle there. They would live in a building that was beautifully furnished and had, you know, art on the walls, and then they would open the doors and say to the neighborhood and anyone else in the city, come join us and enjoy whatever we have to offer. So they would mingle socially and also have the benefit of clubs and classes and lectures and concerts and sports and anything else that anybody wanted to do. And so it was a community center, but there were people living there who would not ordinarily have been living in an industrial neighborhood. And
but who carried on their normal jobs, who worked in the downtown area.
Yes, and carried on their normal jobs. They were not paid staff initially at all. They were volunteers. And they paid room and board to be there. It was pretty inexpensive. And they all ate together at dinner. And then at the really successful houses like Hull House, fascinating people, and in a city like Chicago, fascinating people came through the door. And so, you know, future Prime Minister of Canada came, and Prince Kropotkin from Russia, an anarchist, came, and all sorts of amazing people would come by. Eleanor Roosevelt visited, Theodore Roosevelt visited. And so it was a happening place for middle class, upper middle class people as well. And then for neighbors who are mostly immigrants, recently come to this country, primarily from Europe, but not only. Many of them Jewish, Italian, Irish, you know, the usual mix. They all lived nearby, and they would come and they would enjoy things, and they would have their lives deeply enriched, and they would discover their human capacities to flourish.
It's somewhat astonishing to hear that story just now, because it's hard to conceive of such a place today. The idea that people would willingly mingle with others who are not like them and would uproot their lives to go live there is hard to imagine now. But there's other elements of that I also find really interesting. This idea of intellectual discourse, that people who had something to say, something to talk about, would come by and would discuss these kinds of things. I mean, that's also something that seems to be lost today.
Yeah, and there was a club at Hull House called the Social Science Club, because in the 1890s, social science was really very reformist oriented. It was sort of like, let's talk about ideas that have to do with how to improve the world. That's what social science meant in the 1890s. and it was run by labor union leaders, and they brought in far left radicals, and they brought in moderates and conservatives, and then they would have a moderated debate after the lecture when working class people got to ask these conservative professors anything they liked, and in some cases, some of them were of course real radical socialists, and they had an easier time because the audience was fairly radical. But there were some interesting moments where a conservative professor would have to be faced by an angry, during the Depression of 1893-94, starving, hungry, unemployed men, attacked the conservative professor from Chicago who said, you aren't working hard enough, and if you don't have a job now, go out and find one. And the audience, some of the men in the audience got up and said, "Are you kidding me? I've been looking for a job for months." Just what people today would say. Right. So the same misconceptions about that we see on a part of Republicans, who say unemployment is your problem, it's your individual problem, and it's your fault if you're unemployed, versus an understanding among unemployed people that say, wait a minute, this is structural. This has nothing to do with me personally.
I've been looking for months, or in some cases years.
I'll take any job that can support my family, and I can't get one. So those exchanges happened at Hull House, and you're right, they don't happen where would they happen today?
Well, is it a function of the existence or the invention of television? The television has changed the way we interact with each other and the way we discourse. And my sense is that people interacted with each other much more before the age of television and also before the age of air conditioning, which allowed you to sit inside in your family cocoon and watch the things that you agreed with and not be challenged in your thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because back when there was no TV, people went out to keep themselves entertained. They went out. They went, and there would be these mass meetings in Chicago of thousands of people in auditoriums of vast size that don't exist in this city anymore, where they would have controversial debates. And when the Civic Federation of Chicago was founded, it was founded at one of these mass meetings in an auditorium that's been torn down. And you could see these debates going on in the articles in the Chicago Tribune that describe what was being said. And they were arguing. People would stand up in the audience and say, "No, I disagree with you, blah, blah, blah." And someone else in the audience would stand up and say, "You're wrong." We don't do that anymore.
No, that's astonishing.
It's astonishing.
You could have that kind of interaction.
Yeah, and they were actually engaged with each other in public space. And of course, there was a long tradition of that in the 19th century, because there was a deep culture of public debate in open public spaces, where people would speak up even though they were in the audience. And that's completely gone, except for hecklers, which we don't approve of.
Yes.
Right? But this wasn't heckling.
This was participation.
This was participation, right?
Now, it's interesting, not to digress too far on that, but how you would keep order, in a sense, in a situation like that, and how you would keep the discussion, A, civil, and B, on track.
Well, there was a moderator who, and this is another thing that doesn't happen very well these days. People back then knew Robert's Rules of Order. They actually had skills in chairing a meeting, and they would try to retain control, and they would say, I haven't called on you, sit down, raise your hand. But there was a certain amount of chaos sometimes. And this was in the Depression of 1893-97, and there were a lot of unemployed people in the audience, and they were pretty frustrated. And there were some ministers there who were, again, condescending to the unemployed men and saying, you must be patient. And it was the same issue. And they didn't keep control of the meeting.
Well, so let's fast forward from that then back to Jane Addams. And in this cultural context in which she found herself, what was she hoping to accomplish then through the formation? And was there more than one settlement house, what we know today as
There were hundreds. By 1915, there were like 400 settlement houses in the United States.
And in Chicago, there would have been?
20 or 30.
Okay.
And they're currently 15 at least, I think.
Still operating.
They don't have residents living in them anymore, but the buildings are still there, and the history, they were started, often many of them, in the 1890s.
Well, now, and my wife and I heard you speak, in fact, at Hull House just about a month or so ago. Is that the sort of thing that still goes on there, that there will be speakers and there will be that kind of conversation? Because it was not quite as emotional as the ones you've described. But at that particular event, there were people who stood up. And
Yes.
there were lots of questions and lots of comments from the audience.
Right. Of course, we weren't at a settlement house. We were at a museum.
Yes,
Right.
we were.
We were at the museum that occupies the building that Hull House, the settlement house, used to occupy. Well, nowadays settlement houses have received, historically at least, a lot of money from the state and federal and local governments, and they deliver human services. And so they have a different function. They've become arms of the government. There's a lot of variety in what settlement houses in Chicago and elsewhere still do. Some of them do offer arts programming, and they do advocacy in the court for troubled youth, which is something Hull House also did. So there's a lot of variety, but on the whole, there's a fair amount of social services being delivered.
So coming back to Adams' original vision, now she started the settlement houses here in Chicago, and if I understand that correctly.
Yes.
And then what else? I mean, what was her larger mission, and how? I mean, how do we look on her today as having had enough influence to have a highway named after her?
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised that we started this conversation with Hull House, because that's where most conversations about Adams start. And for people who do know about her, that's what they know. But one of the reasons I wrote actually 2 books about her, is because I could tell there was much more to her than that. You don't win the Nobel Peace Prize if all you did was start a wonderful settlement house.
Yes.
And she actually was a major political figure in her time, really the leading political figure of her time. She was Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Dole and Sarah Palin all rolled into one, except that she couldn't vote. So, and there were
suffrage.
Pardon?
Before suffrage.
Yes, she didn't get the vote until 1920. I mean, actually, Illinois passed a law in 1913 that gave women in Illinois the right to vote for the president, but she didn't get the right to vote for all elections in Illinois until 1920. And she was born in 1860, so she was pretty old by then. But without the vote, she rose to such prominence because she was a political activist. She was a grassroots organizer. She was an advocate for progressive reform. And she advised presidents, starting with McKinley, all the way through to FDR. She was the author of 13 books. She lectured all around the country every year. She supported herself as a speaker and as an author and magazine article writer. So she was very, very famous. In fact, she was more famous than Hillary Clinton is, even though Clinton is the Secretary of State.
So, coming back to an earlier question, how is it that someone of that fame would have faded? Now, you're a scholar. I mean, to you, she has never faded, right? This is all, but
thank you.
But
I'm trying to get her unfaded.
Right, but I think to the general public, it's like Jane Addams. Yeah, I've heard that name. Yeah, I kind of think I have some idea, but not really.
Yeah.
So how does someone of that stature fall into that kind of unknown status today? How does that happen?
Well, it has to do with the place of women in history between when she died, with 1935, and around now. When she died, of course, she was very famous when she was alive, and her memory was kept alive by people who remembered her. But by 1960, which was the centennial of her birth, there was still enough memory of her for the centennial to be a big deal. The mayor of Chicago, Richard M. Daley, had a big banquet in her honor. Richard J. Sorry, I get them confused. Richard J. Daley.
We all do.
They had a big banquet. He spoke. He remembered, how important she was to the city. Archibald MacLeish, the poet, spoke. His mother had been a friend of Jane Addams. So 1960 memories were alive. The problem was that the history books treated her in passing only because they only mentioned her because of the Nobel Peace Prize. They had to mention her.
Okay.
And then they put a picture of her surrounded by children, the famous picture that is the picture most people have seen of her. And the reason that image is so powerful is because it's a traditional image of what a woman should look like. And it's very clear that if you have a very powerful woman in a culture where it does not think women should be politically powerful, the way to handle that is to surround her with children. And
position her back in that traditional role.
In that image, that stereotype. And that happened to her when she was alive, too. And she was called St. Jane. Well, that's a quick way to take a powerful woman and make her into an icon, which is to say, not human, not a model for anyone else, and someone who's so good, so wonderful, that we hardly can believe she's among us, you know. And actually, this was a woman who was terrifically influential, persuasive, political, and powerful. So the gap between the stereotype and who she really was is the reason that I wrote both books.
Because in part of your intention, if I understand it, is to try to revive that memory and for people to come to recognize who Jane Addams as a person was and why she was influential.
Right, and just how she operated in the world. You know, that she was a political mover and shaker.
So that I always love to look at history in the context of now and say, okay, if we look at her life and how she was a political activist, how she was effective, what lessons should we look to draw from that type of approach and her life in general?
Well, there's a lot of lessons. I think one of them is that it's really important for some activists to be free agents.
Meaning what?
Meaning not paid employees of organizations. Now, someone might think that Addams fit that description, but she was a founder and she actually did not take a salary. So founders and anyone who doesn't take a salary from an organization are much freer to say what they believe. And Addams was very clear about that. She was often, people tried to bribe her. In the 1890s, when she was lobbying for child labor law in Illinois, a bunch of manufacturers who employed hundreds of children who were 10 and 8 and 6 came to her and said, we'll give you $10,000 if you will stop lobbying for this law.
And that was a lot of money.
That was like $1 million.
Yeah.
You know, that would have built several buildings, new buildings. And she said, no, I'm not here to make this organization survive. I'm here to try and get children out of the factories. So if it means the destruction of Hull House, so be it. And that's what founders can say.
Yeah, yes.
She created it, she can destroy it.
Yes.
But people who are hired by boards to sustain the life of an organization can't do that. And
well, their livelihood depends on
A,
the
their
maintenance
livelihood
of the
depends on it, right? Their livelihood depends on it. And B, that's their responsibility. They were hired to keep that organization going.
Right.
So they are restrained in what they can say. And what I'm most struck by is when a person is an independent organizer like Addams was, in the sense that she had the freedom to say whatever she thought and she believed that that's what she should do, then they can be a lot more effective nationally and become leaders, whereas people who are employed are limited. So they can advocate for their issue, but they can't be truly radical.
Let's talk for a minute about radical.
Yeah.
Because radical has gotten all sorts of negative connotations. In fact, liberal is a dirty word today. Progressive is a dirty word. And it seems that the ascendancy is if you're not conservative, that somehow you're not American, that you're wrong. So when we use terms like radical and progressive, what are we really talking about? What were the ideas that were so radical and what was so progressive?
Right. It's an important point because people think the radical means certain ideas, which it can, but here's what I mean by Addams being a radical. She believed that since the working class was the majority of people in this country, which it still is, that the issues that they wanted addressed in their lives, like minimum wage, which Addams supported when she was alive, like children under 15 not working full-time.
40-hour work week.
40-hour work week. All things that
we take for granted.
I think pretty much everyone agrees with today, although I know there's some who oppose raising the minimum wage. I don't know that maybe some think there shouldn't be a minimum wage.
Oh, I'm sure there are those who believe that there should be no minimum wage.
So we'll grant that. So I suppose, and there are people who work their employees more than 8 hours, but, you know.
Don't pay them for that.
Don't pay them for that. But, so, you know, those are still issues. But that's what I mean by radical, because in her day, those were radical views. Now, in today, there's still
controversial
lines in the sand, right? They're not actually happening in this country today. A lot of people do not work 8-hour days who are supposed to be working 8-hour days. Overtime, they're not getting paid overtime. The minimum wage is way below what it should be to make a living. You can't live on the minimum wage,
Correct.
which is the whole idea, was it was supposed to be a living wage.
Right.
Especially, it was supposed to be a living wage for a family of 4, not just...
not just you as an individual.
Yeah, right. So that's what I mean by radical, is recognizing that there are issues affecting the majority of Americans that need to be legislatively addressed, that are going to significantly improve the condition of the country as a whole. And that's why prosperous people like Adams and like you and me should be supporting those issues.
So, and it's interesting that you bring up the subject being prosperous, and Jane Addams herself came from a prosperous family, right?
Yep.
And so, it similarly to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was considered a traitor to his class,
Yep.
But was in a position to be able to push things through that perhaps, not having come from that class, he might not have had that ability to do. So does that mean that there is a special duty of people who are more prosperous to turn around and recognize what's going on and think about something outside of their own condition?
Yeah.
Is that a lesson from Jane Addams?
It is, and it's also something that Addams tried to help people think about while she was alive, because she did come from that background. People don't know this, but she was actually broke by 1894. She had invested a lot of her inheritance in Hull House. She gave away a lot of money to friends who were neighbors in need. She supported herself from her earnings as an author, a speaker, after that. But she took no salary from Hull House. But she really didn't have a lot of money. However, she remembered what it was like to be wealthy,
Yes.
and she had the attitudes coming to Hull House. She had the attitudes of a wealthy person. She had a lot of learning to do about just how equal she was to working class people whose lives had been so different than hers.
Now, one of the things, this is a little bit far afield, but one of the things you and I talked about briefly before the show was the idea of power and the kinds of power people have that they may not recognize. And you were talking specifically about just doing a show like this, that this gives a certain amount of power to be able to have you on, for example, and talk about these things. So I'd like to explore that subject a little bit and think about what is it that people have power to do, and how could they recognize that they may have some powers that they don't see right away, and focus those on things that they may feel are out of their control, but they actually can influence.
Well, that's a great question, and that relates to your other question of what Addams tried to help people understand regarding their privilege. She wrote very eloquently in the introduction to a book called Democracy and Social Ethics, which was her first book, which is in print, paperback from the University of Illinois Press. You can
And everyone should read it?
Everyone should read it. She wrote very eloquently in that introduction about the fact that prosperous people can become very focused in their own lives and can only associate with people who think like they do. And she says that.
And that she wrote, when did she write that book? In
1902.
So 110 years ago, and
Right.
that's every bit as true today as it was then.
Right. So she was saying, if you want to get out of your narrow life, the thing to do is go learn about the lives of lots of other Americans whose lives are different than yours. But don't do it, as sort of like an investigation of an object.
You're not an anthropologist.
Right. Go do it as a Democrat small d. Go do it because they're fellow Americans. Go learn about the lives of other people, with mutual exchange of conversation. And she said, because you gain those experiences on the common road of life, as she put it, it will change your understanding of how you will vote politically. And that's a very powerful insight. She's also saying you're not going to really know how to vote right, from her point of view, if you don't get out of your house, turn off your TV, if you don't get to know people from all walks of life. And she meant ethnically too, racially.
And now it's, of course, much easier for people who are prosperous and white to do that and take those steps. Someone who's a poor and minority, it can't just knock on the door of someone who's a stockbroker and say, hey, what's going on? No,
it's true, although, right. I mean, and that's why settlement houses were created.
in order to get that they don't really
to
serve
be that bridge.
But they don't really do that function so much anymore.
No, they don't. And one of the questions, for us now is
How
your question.
How do you do that?
How do you do that? The Occupy movement, when it was happening, did have a certain amount of cross-cultural, cross-class mingling going on. I mean, it wasn't particularly noted by the media, but it was happening. There were some very prosperous people sitting in the parks next to some very unemployed and not very wealthy people. So that happened, but we didn't, the media didn't really comment on it. I think it's our challenge. I mean, one of the things Adam's always said, and I learned this from studying her, is that you have to catch the wave of your times. You have to think about, how do our times think about this issue? So she would not have said we need to start settlement houses all over again. That was for her time.
Right.
We have to
figure out something.
Figure out what fits our time.
Any ideas?
Any ideas? Well, I think partly is what you were also saying about we need to have more public debates where people from different classes come together. And I think that would be a good start, is to find ways to have large audiences where it's free admission and the speakers are not just political candidates, but are people who have interesting ideas that are controversial, and invite the world, and then let the audience participate.
Is that possible in an age of television? And particularly people who've grown up and trained to sit silently in front of the tube.
True, people just watch it on the internet. I know, they won't come out. I don't know. Maybe you have to offer free pizza or something.
Yes.
I don't know.
Free Pepsi. Free sugary drinks.
Free sugary drink. No. It's a puzzle. It's a puzzle. I mean, I think that there are neighborhoods that have the potential to have cross-class social interactions, because not all neighborhoods are economically segregated. But what's the mechanism? Public libraries have this potential, but they usually don't have auditoriums, big enough.
Right.
I don't know.
Then I'll have to wrap us up then on a stumper of a question. We'll leave it up to our audience to ponder that.
I was going to say, I think the audience has this question to solve.
Yeah. So anyway, well, Louise, I want to thank you so much for being here. It's really been a wonderful treat. I know we've just scratched the surface of what Jane Addams' life was really about.
Yes, we have.
And how it relates back to us today. So I hope you'll come back sometime soon and we can continue the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me.
My pleasure. Thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. We've been visiting with Louise Knight, author and visiting scholar at Northwestern University. So please catch us every Saturday night at 8 o'clock on Channel 19 Comcast. And you can also find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. Till next time, thank you and good night.